Now, where does the idea come from? What are the Chinese thinking of when they present something like this? Well, I think the best way to think about this is that China, reflecting on its own extraordinary and unprecedented and probably never to be repeated transformation, thought, well, how did we do it? We did it essentially through extremely large-scale investment led by the state, crucially in infrastructure, which produced this extremely rapid economic growth. Now, we're not a model because we're so different from other countries, but surely some of those lessons can be applicable to the Eurasian landmass. And so the idea was that especially the Asian part of the Eurasian landmass, where many of the countries are poor, that perhaps the Eurasian landmass can be transformed in the same way that China has been transformed by this kind of approach. And I think that if we to understand China, one of the key words I think you have to understand, we have to grasp, is development. China is, in our time, the great exponent of development. By development, I mean development for the developing world. China is the master of this experience and is obviously in a very different position to the United States or Europe and so on, because as rich countries, as developed countries, they don't have the same affinity with it, they don't have the same experience of it. China does. So if there was one country that was going to be able to take this initiative, it was China, because China has this experience, because China has the vision, China has the money, and also...
We are sorry to interrupt you, but before we move on to the next point, we noticed that a lot of you are returning viewers who have not subscribed. If you've enjoyed our content, subscribing would mean the world to us. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for us. Thank you for your support.
Also think of China not just as a country, but as a continent. Not just as a continent, but in my view, as a sub-global system in its own right. 1/5 of the world's population, huge landmass, and so on. The Belt and Road Initiative, well, I don't know how successful it's going to be. It's a very long-term program. Don't measure it in 5 years or 10 years. I think, in a minimum, several decades, maybe 50 years, something like that, because we're talking about a huge project. But if it's even half successful, it is going to transform not just the Eurasian landmass, it's going to transform the world as we know it. Now, let me draw your attention at this point to this map here. The centre, where is the centre of the global economy? Well, this is from Danny Quah, who's now at Lee Kuan Yew School, but it was at LSE. And in 1980, Danny Quah estimated that the centre of the global economy was here, in the Eastern Atlantic, where you'd expect it to be. It was essentially, the global economy was essentially a transatlantic economy. And then slowly it's been moving, like here. And at this point, it is somewhere around here. So actually, not too far away from where we are now. And by 2050, he estimates that it'll be on the Sino-Indian border. In other words, what we're witnessing is the shift of the centre of the global economy from here to the Eurasian landmass. This is going to be the engine of global development. This is going to be the centre of the global economy. It's also, it follows, in time, will be the centre, as it were, of the global polity. And so this is an extraordinary shift that in some degree, I think this is taking place, quite frankly, anyway. The question is, the speed will be accelerated by the success or otherwise of the Eurasian, of BRI. This is GDP measured by purchasing power parity. For 2030, he estimates that China will account for 1/3 of the global economy. America, you see, is 15%, EU 13%. Second biggest will be India, 90%. Of course, India and China are the two key components in population terms of the Eurasian landmass. So we're talking about not just the landmass, but we're talking about a huge global shift. Now we know that globalization, as conceived in the period since 1980, the sort of Anglo-Saxon model of globalization, starting with Reagan and Thatcher, has now hit extremely serious problems with rejection of that model, strongest in the United States, to some extent also in my own country, Britain, but also a great deal of negativity in the European mainland and so on. Why? First of all, well, there are two key reasons. I mean, first of all, is obviously sections of the population in the United States and so on have done badly during the era of globalization. Basically, wages stagnated decade upon decade. And that's true of my own country, it's true of some of the other European countries as well. But there's another way in which globalization, Western-style globalization, failed. And that is that while some countries, some parts of the world, like East Asia, did really well from it, not least China, if you look at the Eurasian landmass, a lot of countries did not benefit from it. Central Asia, North Africa, and so on. So Belt and Road introduces a different model, I think, of globalization, a successor model of globalization, rooted in not the developed world, but the developing world, where growth is much faster. The growth is a bit under 2.5%, 2.5 times that of the developed world at the moment. Just worthwhile bearing this in mind, in the mid-1970s, 2/3 of the global GDP was produced by the rich world, which is the West plus Japan, and now the developing world is just ahead in terms of a bit about 51-52% compared to the West, the rich world's 48-49%. And by 2030, the projection is that the developing world, where, let's face it, 85% of the world's population lives as opposed to only 15% in the rich world, it'll be something like 2/3 responsible, 2/3 of global GDP will come from the developing world. So this is a very new way of thinking, and the next stage of globalization would transform the world, as opposed to transforming a limiting part of the world. Another aspect of BRI is that hitherto this model of globalization, to some extent earlier globalization, was essentially a maritime phenomenon. It was the sea routes that were the transformative element in terms of trade and so on. With this, the BRI, then this is going to be a new model where the land routes will be, in many ways, probably as important as the sea routes. So that'll be another difference. Now, another aspect, I think, of the impact of this model of globalization, or this transformation, is going to be what I'll call political, in the sense that one of the great failures of this era of globalization that we've witnessed so far is, I think, that there's a governance deficit in large parts of the world, not least in the Eurasian landmass. Not in the western part of the world, not in the China. China can never be accused of having a governance deficit. But for many countries, they are undergoverned, and institutions are weak and so on. I think this era of BRI could see a major transformation in this governance deficit towards something rather different. I think also we'll see, linked to that, a rapid multiplying of institutions of lots of different kinds. I mean, if you're going to have this kind of transformation, which is based on bilateral and multilateral cooperation between countries, China obviously being central to most of them, if not all of them, then there's going to be lots of new institutions. And, you know, ASEAN plus one is with the Chinese cooperation, or ASEAN plus three, is one of the elements, one of the models, I think, for what we're likely to see in the future in the Eurasian landmass. The other point, and the final point I want to make, is this. I think it's inconceivable that if this project is, you know, even moderately successful, let alone hugely successful, then the whole notion of polity, of what polities mean on the Eurasian landmass, is going to be transformed. It's just inconceivable that you could get these levels of cooperation, if it happens. If you get these levels of cooperation, this kind of economic transformation, on a landmass which accounts for 2/3 of the world's population, that the way in which government is conceived now, compared with what it will be in the future, will be profoundly different. And I think the change, if it's successful, will be far greater than any of the changes we saw during the Western era of globalization, which started in 1980 up until the present day. Thank you very much.
What do you guys think? Do guys think he is right about the Chinese and other developing economy? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.